It's good. You're seeing the.
Yes, it looks good. And so, Luke, when we get started, I will do the introduction and then turn it over to you. You'll probably want to double check to make sure that we don't get muted. Sometimes that happens.
Yeah.
Telly will mute and turn everyone's video off, and so you can check that. And then you'll have the floor for 45 minutes or so. And then I can moderate questions and people can, they can either unmute themselves or type in the chat, and I can moderate that.
Okay.
Alfredo, did you want to say anything else before we get started?
No. Maybe I'll just say something like see you in 2 weeks from now at the end.
Okay.
Which is not going to be 2 weeks from now, or is it, Telly? Maybe.
I think this is the last one of this series.
Yeah, so it's not going to be that. So just thank everybody for having been with us. Just that.
Okay.
Let's admit Rodney.
I'm gonna admit everyone in.
Okay. Let's admit Rodney.
Hello. Hi, Luke.
Hey.
I just got your email. So.
So we'll wait just a few more minutes before we get started. Hey, look, I'm actually going to get started here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Ted Heindel. I'm at Iowa State University, and thank you for continuing to join us for this, our IJMF Spotlight Seminar Series. This is the last one of this semester, and you'll hear from us when we get the ones planned for in the future. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Luke Deike, who's an assistant professor of mechanical and aerospace engineering and affiliated with the High Meadows Environmental Institute at Princeton. Luke joined the faculty in 2017, and he came from University of California at San Diego, where he was a postdoctoral researcher at the Scripps Institute for Oceanography. Luke received his PhD from the University of Paris, Diderot in 2013, and a master's and bachelor's from École Normale Supérieure in Paris. He is the recipient of a NSF Career Award in 2019. And today he's going to talk to us and give a great lecture on mass transfer in ocean atmospheric interface, the role of breaking waves, droplets, and bubbles. So Luke, the floor is all yours.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation to give this lecture. It's really a great pleasure and honor. So I'll be talking about some of the work that's been done in my group over the past few years, trying to describe mass exchange at the ocean atmosphere, and why it's important and how do we quantify the multiple scales that are being involved. And so I'm going to start with describing a little bit like what the ocean atmosphere interface looks like when you are at fairly high wind speed. So you have a picture showing a large breaking event photographed from a research platform on the slide. And you see these white patches, this white foam that corresponds to these bubbles that are at various depths under the water. And so a lot of the talk is going to be about characterizing air entrainment, characterizing the bubbles under the breaking waves, and then how they come back to the surface, burst at the surface, and eject sea spray aerosols. So I'm going to start this with a movie, and you also have some sound of the ocean on top of it. And so this is pictures and movie taken from a research cruise in the North Atlantic in winter with a storm where the wind exceeded 25 meters per second. And so you get a very rough sea, you get these constant breaking events, these white patches, you see spray being transported in the air. And so you have this highly turbulent and nonlinear two-phase flow that you want to characterize. And this is very much what I'm going to be talking about today. So why do we want to look at this problem? The ocean atmosphere interface plays a critical role for the climate system. And you can think of two mass exchange that are quite important. The first one would be the transfer of gas from air to water. So you're going to have air entrainment, you're going to have these bubbles, and they are going to contribute to the carbon uptake. And so quantifying this nonlinear process, the entrainment of bubbles, the dissolution in the water column, is going to be important if you want to do a carbon or oxygen budget. So that's going to be one very important aspect. The other important aspect, which is going to be the focus of today's talk, is the transfer from the water side to the air side. So the droplets that are being ejected by breaking wave, this is going to be done through direct wave shearing of the surface, atomization of the surface, as well as bubble bursting. So when the bubbles come back at the surface, they are going to sit sometime at the air-water interface, and then they are going to burst and emit drops, either film drops or jet drops. And these drops are going to be important because they are going to contribute, or they're going to modulate the momentum flux between the atmosphere and the ocean. They are going to modulate the heat fluxes, especially at very high wind speed, and they are going to modulate the moisture fluxes. And finally, and maybe most importantly, the droplets, once they are in the air, they can be transported up in the atmosphere and then leave particles, so sea salt particles or biological particles, whatever was in the water. And these aerosols can serve as cloud condensation nuclei, and they are going to affect the radiative balance. So that's going to be an order one effect on the climate system. So these are the reasons to look at this problem. I'm going to go a little bit deeper on like why we were still, it's been a long-standing problem, and why we still need to continue to quantify or better quantify the mechanism emitting ocean spray aerosols. And I'm going to mention three really sort of open questions that we'll touch on during the seminar. The first one is the most basic one. It's just that there is still a very large uncertainty on the production flux. So this is a plot of the production flux. So the number of droplets, the number of aerosols as a function of its size. So it's a size distribution going from about 10 nanometer to 20 micron. And each of these lines or shaded area is going to be a fit from some data either in the field or upscaled from the lab, from various studies starting in the 80s and up to some recent stuff. And this is from a review in 2011, and you have similar plots in more recent review. And what you see is that at any given scale, so if you look at the 100 nanometer particles or the 10 micron particles, you still have a very large spread in these various parametrizations. So there is still a very large uncertainty on how many drops are being emitted, how many aerosols are being emitted. And there is also an uncertainty on the shape of the size distribution. And wind speed is not going to be alone able to give you a simple answer. If you look at the sea salt budget, you have an uncertainty of a factor 50 if you count globally the emissions of sea salt. So this is the first one that's sort of like the most important piece. The second reason to look at the mechanism and try to understand them better is if you understand the mechanism better, then you might understand the role of temperature on emitting sea spray. This is a plot from a 2018 paper by Forestieri et al. And so what you have here is a normalized flux so that it's 1 at 20 degrees. So you take one of these curves, you integrate to get the total volume or the total concentration, and then it's normalized. And you look at variations in temperature. And what's really striking here is that the different curves that come from different papers, again, either lab analysis or field data analysis, some of the data are going down, right? Going from a larger flux at low temperature to a lower flux at high temperature. And then some curves go the other way around. They go up with an increase in sea salt, in sea spray emissions with temperature. And so what you can think is that if you use one or the other of these formulations and implement them in a climate model and you run forward for hundreds of years, with an increase in the sea surface temperature, then you're going to get very different results in terms of your sea spray emissions. So that's very much an important thing to understand better. And finally, the third reason to look at this problem in detail is if you want to go beyond sea salt and think about the composition of ocean spray aerosols, whether it's, so salt is going to be an obvious content, but you can also have organic material. You have in the upper layer of the ocean, you're going to have organic material that come from biological activity. And so what's been known for a while, and in particular studied by Kim Prazer's group at UCSD, is the enrichment of the droplets and then particles emitted by the various mechanism. And the point is that the droplets emitted from film drop or jet drops are going to be enriched in very different ways depending on the mechanism. And so again, having a fundamental understanding, having a good way of quantifying these emissions of sea spray is important if you want to include these effects. And particles of different composition affect very differently the atmospheric chemistry. So these are all the motivations in a sense. These are all the reasons to dive into this problem in detail. And the way we have been approaching this is by separating this problem that spans multiple time and length scale into 3 buckets of problems. So if you start at the largest scales, if you think about my movie of breaking waves at high wind speed, you could make a schematic like this one, which is that if you look at the patch of ocean of maybe a kilometer square or so, and the wind is high enough, then you're going to get these like intermittent in space and time breaking events. And so you're going to want to characterize the statistics of breaking waves. And this is going to be done through a particular metric, which is going to be counting the breaking events as you look at them from the top and how fast they travel. And so you're going to get a breaking distribution at these like sorts of large scale. If you from a fluid mechanics, like from a drops and bubbles fluid dynamicist point of view, this is very much a large scale problem. If you think about the total ocean or the total climate system, this is still a small scale problem because it's going to be below your grid size for a global system model. But this is going to be my largest scale. So I'm going to want to characterize the breaking statistics. If I then focus on one particular breaking event, then this is going to be scales from like maybe 100 microns to a meter. And there I want to look at the dynamic of the breaking wave, find the scales that control the breaking waves, and then characterize how much air is being entrained, how much turbulence is being generated, how much spray is being produced, these sorts of stuff. And so this, I'm going to be looking at it from a dynamical point of view, and I'm going to use like laboratory experiments, large-scale laboratory experiments, or simulations. And finally, I'm going to want to go to the individual bubble processes, bubbles and drop processes. So this is going to be diving to a micron and below, up to a few millimeters. And I'm going to be looking at, so if I was going to do the gas transfer problem, I would be looking at the diffusion of gas from a single bubble. Today, I'll focus about the productions of drops by these bubbles that come to the surface and pop. So these are the three types of scales that I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to start by the middle scale. I'm going to start by the physics of breaking waves. So the physics of breaking wave has been looked at quite extensively through lab work and field work, but let's focus on the lab work for now. These are pictures taken in a wave tank where we create a controlled breaking event by focusing wave energy in the middle of the channel. So you think about like 30-meter wave tank, you have a wave paddle at one end, you move the wave paddle in a way where you force the high frequency wave first, the low frequency wave after, and you tune the phase so that they all meet at the center of the channel, because the high frequency waves are going to travel slower than the low frequency wave. So you do this, and if you do that, then you know exactly where your breaking is going to occur, and you have a very repeatable experiments. And so this is like one movie from these sorts of experiments. This technique has been used like extensively by various groups, including Ken Melville, Jim Duncan, Mike Banner, Mark Perlin, and others. So you get these sorts of pictures. So you get here the breaking front, the jet that collapses into the water column, the entrainment of this pocket of air, and then all of these bubbles that spend some time underwater. And what this literature has taught us is that the breaking properties are going to be mostly provided by the speed of the breaker, c, which basically sets the scale of the wave, and the height of the breaker, so here h, because the height of the breaker is going to constrain like the volume over which air entrainment occurs and over which turbulence is generated. And then you have an additional velocity scales, which is the ballistic velocity of the breakers. And with that, you're going to be able to do sets of scalings regarding energy dissipation, air entrainment, and so on. So these two are going to be things that we're going to keep going. We're going to use quite a lot: the speed of the breaker c and the slope of the breaker. So the height of the breaker times the wave number. So basically the ratio of the wave height to the wavelength. And so at a given speed, the higher the slope, the more air is going to be entrained, or the more energy is going to be dissipated. And so what we have been doing is developing numerical simulations to look at this problem. These are simulations done by a former postdoc in my group, Wouter Mustard, who is now faculty at Oxford. And what we have here is a compact wave train that propagates and then breaks, entraining a large pocket of air. You had the top view on the left. Now you're going to see in the bottom view moving on. And so you see that as the wave impacts the surface, you get this entrainment of this large air pocket that breaks down into multiple bubbles of various sizes. And from these numerical simulations, we can quantify air entrainments and bubble statistics and compare to laboratory measurements that have been performed. And so this brings us to this plot, which summarize bubble size distributions and their breaking wave. And so what you have is on the left axis, on the y-axis, you have the normalized bubble size distribution. It's normalized by some geometrical factor that account for the size of the air pocket and the turbulence dissipation rate. And it's plotted as a function of the bubble size divided by the Hinze scale. The Hinze scale is defined by balancing surface tension and turbulence dissipation rate. And it's thought as like a critical length scale for stability of the bubble. If your bubble is larger than the Hinze scale, then it can deform and break. If it's smaller than the Hinze scale, then turbulence shouldn't be able to break it. And what you see from these collections of data, where you have our numerical data and then various experimental data and also other groups of numerical data, is a steep power law for bubbles larger than the Hinze scales, with a scaling that's in bubble size to the power minus 10^3. And then a shallower scaling for the size distribution below the Hinze scale, with bubbles following a size to the minus 3/2. And so the steep one for the super Hinze bubbles can be effectively described by a turbulent breakup model, initially proposed by Garrett in 2000 and then discussed by many others since. What we had focused in the last few years was trying to understand what was going on for the smaller bubbles. So to do this, what Dan, who is a grad student who's now postdoc at ETH, did is experiments where he simplified the problem, right? We removed the wave and we did a simple experiment in the lab where we generate turbulence with jets, and then we inject a large air cavity in the middle of the domain. And so here is rotating a cup where there was air, and that's releasing like a large air pocket. And then we're tracking the bubble sizes as the air pocket fragments in the turbulence water. And it gives you the plot of the size distribution on the right of the slide, with again on the x-axis the bubble size divided by the Hinze scale, and then here the size distribution. If you start with an initial bubble that is like just above the Hinze scale, so that's going to be the bluish curve, then you see that you're like just producing some children of sizes that are slightly smaller than the injection size, but not that much. As you increase the separation of scales between the injection and the Hinze scale, you get to the yellow line, and then you see that you form a very nice r to the minus 3/2 power law, which means that you're producing very small bubbles by starting from a very large air cavity. So this is the observation, and it's consistent with what we see under breaking waves. So Voter and Aguinor did simulations of placing a bubble in a homogeneous and isotropic turbulent flow numerically, and then looking at the influence of this separation of scale, which is the same as looking at varying the Weber number. So on the left, the animation shows like a bubble that's initially slightly above the critical Hinze scale, and it deforms gently and breaks into a couple of other fragments or a couple of other bubbles. On the right, you have a bubble that is initially much larger than the Hinze scale, which you see deforms greatly and then leaves a stream of tiny bubbles behind it. And so what you're observing, and that you can summarize in the sketch on the right, is that when you have a bubble that's initially close to the Hinze scale, then you have a local production. You have a weak breakup and local production in this space. But when you start with a bubble much larger than the Hinze scale, you're producing both bubbles locally and non-locally with these strong breakups. So you have this sort of like shortcut where from a very large scale, you produce a very tiny one. So we went into trying to understanding the time scale and the processes behind that. And this is an analysis that was done by Aguinor. And so what Aguinor did was taking these simulations and doing an analysis breakup by breakup. So this is like a snapshot, couple of snapshots showing a sequence of breakup. And you see these like long filaments that fragments into multiple children. And what Aguinor did was to decompose this sequence into a set of binary breakups. So every breakup has a parent of size capital delta, and then the children where the smallest size is small delta. And then the second children has the complementary size so that you conserve volume. And so you track this into our ensemble of simulations, and you get the plot on the right, where every single colored point is one breakup in our chains of events. And so you have the time normalized by the capillary time. And here you have the size of the smallest children. And what you see is that the time to produce this small children is always smaller than the dotted line. And the dotted line is the eddy turnover time at scale delta. So that means that every breakup is faster than the turbulence at the smallest scale, at the turbulence at the scale of the smallest bubble. The second thing you're seeing is that while if you look at the events individually, you have a very broad distribution. However, if you ensemble average, then you get the black points, and the black points very nicely land into the capillary time at the smallest children. And so what we get is that the breakup of elongated filament is controlled by the capillary time of the smallest scale, which maybe is not that surprising, right? It's basically saying that once you have elongated your filament, it's going to break due to capillarity, and it has forgotten about the turbulence that has initially deformed the bubble. So the turbulence is effectively frozen during the rapid breakup sequence. And this is very similar to ideas we had developed to work on the pinch-off of bubbles and turbulence in the previous paper. So you get this sort of two-step breakup process that we described in a paper in 2022. So first you start with a large bubble. It first deforms. That's happening over timescale controlled by turbulent flow. And then at some point it forms a neck or an elongated filament. And then the breakup of that elongated filament is controlled by capillarity. If you take these ideas and you write a population balance equation, you end up by finding that indeed your size distribution, if it's controlled by these rapid capillary breakup, then the size distribution should scale with the size of the bubble to the power -3/2. So you get to this summary for a universal description of the bubble size distribution and the breaking wave, where you have two power laws. One of them can be well described by a turbulent breakup cascade. And so that's been first described by Garrett in 2000. You have the lab work from Dean and Stokes. You have multiple other work since, including from Alfredo Soldati on fragmentations of drops and bubbles. So this R minus 10 stops at the Hinze scale, and then you have a shallower slope that follows something close to something given by this capillary argument that we have been describing. So this sort of wraps up my intermediate scales. If you have a breaking wave and you know how fast it's traveling, so its breaking speed, and you know its slope, then I can tell you how much air is being entrained and what's the bubble population from these physical arguments. So now that we have that, what we want is to look at each of these individual bubbles and how much spray they produce, so how many droplets they are going to eject back into the air. And so for that, we developed a lab experiment. This was initially started by Baptiste Nel, who was a postdoc, who is now back in France in Toulouse, and is now taken over by Megan Mazatenta, who is a grad student in the lab. So we created an experiment where we inject a bubble population that we can control through the needle size and the level of turbulence in the water. And these bubbles rise to the surface, and then they spend some time at the surface, and then they burst. And so what we're going to do is that in this experiment, we're going to measure the bubble size distribution in the bug. We're going to measure the bubble size distribution at the surface, and we're going to measure the droplets and the aerosols being emitted in the air. And the idea is to then make these connections between the bubble population through its different lifetime, in a sense. So you can engineer the bubble size distribution to mimic the one in the breaking wave, because now you know which element you need, right? You need to inject large bubbles and break them with turbulence, and you're going to naturally create these two power laws. And so you get a surface bubble size distribution that mimics what you wanted to have. So this is what is being shown here. You have two sorts of symbols that correspond to two types of zoom to get bubbles down to about 20 micron in sizes. These are the smallest one we capture with the most zoomed in view, and then also the largest one that are close to a centimeter. And then we're going to measure the droplets and aerosol size distribution. And so to do that, we're going to combine various technologies. The first one is going to be measuring the droplets above, say, 10 microns through an orographic system. We can also use shadowgraphy. We have used both and verified that they give consistent results. So these drop here on the right hand side, right side of the plot are obtained from orographic measurements. So it's directly measuring the droplets as they travel in the air. Then we get the dry size particle by sucking air from the closed chamber and then drying the droplets and measuring their sizes through either optical technique. This is an OPS sensor. And so here you get sizes from a little bit below 1 micron to almost 10 micron. And then the smallest particles are going to be measured by a scanning mobility sensor with the same principle. You extract a volume with your liquid drops, you dry, and then you measure the solid particles that is left behind. And so these experiments were done in salt water, so artificial seawater with a mix of salt that mimics the ocean. And so the dry particles are essentially salt particles. Okay, so the question is, can we understand how we go from this bubble size distribution to this droplet size distribution? So if we go back to bubble bursting and productions of drops and aerosols from bubble bursting, there are two branches of literature. One of them describes the production of film drops. So you have here a large bubble that ruptures at its foot, and then like ejection of the sheet, of the thin sheet, and then productions of droplets. This has been described by Blanchard in the 60s, and then more recently, a lot of work in the group from Emmanuel Villamot. And this process is most effective for bubbles that are going to be above the capillary lengths, but it can work also below. And then the second process that's been described in the literature is called as jet drops, which is the collapse of the cavity. So once the film has popped, you're left with an underwater bubble or underwater cavity, which has an unstable shape. And you get capillary waves that propagate towards the center that are going to focus, and then jet is going to emerge that then destabilize and produce drops. And this is thought to be most effective below the capillary lengths and it's going to be controlled by the ratio between the bubble size and the viscous capillary length. And so it's going to be typically from 10 micron to a couple of millimeters. So we have looked at this numerically. These are simulations, again, done using the open source solver Basilisk. And so here you're focusing on a single bubble. You start with the open cavity. You see the propagation, the collapse of the cavity and the propagation of these capillary waves. The bubble size is about 1 millimeter in this particular simulation. You see the ejection of the jet. It's an axisymmetric simulation, and then you get a couple of drops being emitted. And so we compared this work and validated this work against lab experiments, and then went into finding or analyzing how the droplet size is going to scale with the bubble property. So the dynamic for these jet drop emissions is controlled by the ratio, by what's called the Laplace number, which is the ratio of the bubble size over the viscous capillary length. The viscous capillary length is obtained by combining density, surface tension, and viscosity of the liquid. And what you see on this plot is the profile at drop ejection from a set of simulations for different Laplace number. So you go from the blue color, which is a low Laplace number. If you go in air-water condition, that would be a 10 micron bubble. And so what you see there is a very thin jet, and it's going to be also a very fast jet. And so you're going to create a droplet much smaller than the bubble size. And then you move to higher Laplace number, so larger bubbles. You go up to the red one, which is about 2 millimeter, which is close to the threshold for jet drop ejection. And there you get a thicker jet and a much larger drop size. And so from this simulation, you can span the whole parameter space. This was done by Alexis, who was a PhD student jointly with Stéphane Popinet and Thomas Héon in Paris. And then Yao Lai, who was a grad student in MAE with Howard Stone and did a gig with myself, who is now a faculty. So you get the droplet size as a function of the bubble size normalized by the viscous capillary length. And you have all of our data together with data from the group from J.C. Bird at BU, that's the Brass et al. Paper, And then the French experiments from Elisabeth Gabache. And so all of these experiments and simulation lie on top of each other. And you see that you have a minimum drop size here that is obtained for a Laplace number of about 1,000. And then a very nice scaling of the droplet size as a function of the bubble size. And the solid line is the scaling proposed by Gagné and Cavo in 2017. There are similar scalings proposed by Gordillo that also describe very well this relationship between the drop size and the bubble size. So what do you have? You have that one-to-one correspondence. I'm not going to talk about like the very viscous cases here or the very small ones. I'm going to focus really on this part because these are the ones really relevant for our water condition. And so you can describe your droplet size as a function of the bubble size and the parameters of the water. So this is what you have, right? You have the size of the drops as a function of the size of the bubble for a single bubble bursting. You can do similar work and get the function for the number of drops. You can also get the velocity. And then you can also do the drop size probability distribution by doing ensemble of these experiments or simulations. And so you can get all of this and model it in a very reasonable way. So if you have all of these information, then now you can do a convolution of your bubble population. That's my QRB here, and that's what is underlined in red. And the bubble population, the first part of the talk has described how you get it. And so you convolute it with this number of droplets being emitted and their size, and the size probability distribution. And if you integrate, if you span over all the bubble sizes, then you get the size distributions of drops. So you can do this. And now you can go back to your experiments or my experiments and compare what this model would be for a bubble size distribution from jet drops. And you get the following function, assuming that bubbles above 50 micron are effective. And you get this dotted line, and you have no fitting parameter here. It's really, you take as input the bubble size distribution, and then you use the function derived from single bursting. And so you have a very good description of the largest drop in your system, above, let's say, 2 to 3 micron, by the process of jet drops. But it doesn't describe the smallest one. So for the smallest one, you can turn to the scalings proposed by Viramo's group through 2 different modes of production for film drop that would account for some of the like micron size, and then also the ones around 100 nanometer or so. And you still have some gap in size, but you have these 3 mechanisms or these 3 processes that allow you to describe a fair amount of your observed droplets and aerosol size distribution. So I'm going to take this as my, I'm going to use this framework to compute the size distributions of drops and aerosols from the physics of breaking wave. So to do that, if I want to upscale to the field, I need a description of the ensemble of breaking waves. And this is what I'm going to do now. And I'm going to do it in 2 steps. The first one is going to be describing how to do it formally and use field measurements. And then I'm going to see how we can do modeling to better understand the breaking wave statistics. So conceptually, what I want to do is something quite similar to what I did to go from one bubble to many bubbles, is I want to do a superposition of the ensemble of breaking wave and what the single breaking wave does. And this is what I call from the lab to the field. So I'm going to write down VA as the air entrainment rate from an ensemble of breaking wave. And I'm going to describe my ensemble of breaking wave as the length of breaking crest, the distribution of lengths of breaking crest lambda c, which I'll explain a bit more in the next slide. And everything that's underlined in blue is basically the physics of a single breaking wave. And if you followed what I've been talking about, this is what I described in the first part of the talk. So you can write down a scaling for the air entrainment by a single breaker, and it's going to depend on the wave slope, hk, and it's going to depend on the speed of the breaker. And you find a power to the 3. So you get this function V, L, that's a function of C. And then you're going to integrate over all the breaking events. This is something we derived in a 2017 paper when I was still at Scripps. And it very much extends the work from Owen Phillips in the 80s that describes the breaking wave statistics. So, okay, that's nice. Conceptually, now you need to measure or model your breaking distribution. So this was really pioneered by Ken Melville at Scripps in developing airborne measurements of the breaking distribution. So the animation on the left is a movie taken from an airplane. So you fly an airplane with a visible camera and you look at the breaking patch. And so that's why the frame is moving faster than the breaking, right? The plane is moving faster than the breaking event, than the wave. And you see that big white patch. And so then if you take these images and you georeference them, you get like one still in the center of the slide where you can extract a length for this breaking front. And then if you have successive images, you could extract a velocity. So you can measure your distribution of lengths of breaking crest in the field. And it gives this sort of plot, this lambda of C as a function of C. This is taken from multiple measurements from Chris Zappa's group, Ken's group, and then also Jim Thompson's group. So Chris Zappa is at Columbia, Jim Thompson is at University of Washington. And so you get like a broad spread in the data that depends on the wind and wave conditions, but it's basically something you can measure. So if you have this being measured, then you can combine all the pieces of my story, which is getting the C-spray generation function, FD of RD, as an integral, a double integral, an integral over the C state, so over lambda CDC, and then the volume of air entrained by a single breaking wave, the size distribution of bubbles, that would be going from multiple breakers to individual breakers, and then the production of the individual droplets. That's what's in blue. You can look up the derivation in the papers or in the review, but the idea conceptually is very much to look at the processes in a separate way, and then you recombine. And we're going to use separate relationship for film or jet drops. So you get that C-spread generation function. So if we take a particular storm event here, it's a storm in the Southern Ocean with a model breaking distribution. You end up with the C-spread generation function that's the same as what I had in the intro slide. And you get these blue and red curves, which are for two different time during the storm, which the same wind speed, which is about 18 meters per second, but different sea states. So you see that the differences in the sea state at a given wind speed lead to a shift in the distribution. And everything that you have in like green shaded line or all the gray dotted dash and solid and all of that in the background are various parametrization that exist in the literature and that are used in model. And so the conclusion here is that what we get from our approach is very much coherent with what other people had done. You can't have a definite answer whether or not our formulation is better, because you would need perfect field data for that, which is hard to get. But the point is that this framework that is a bottom-up framework where you don't fit parameters at the end, right? You fit them separately, step by step, gives you an answer that seems very much right. So it's very coherent between our approach, our theoretical approach, and these observational data. And then you get that waves-induced variability that explains some of the scatter between the data and the parametrization. So this is like sort of where we are. Now that we have this, we can implement our results in a global model. And so if you want to use a global wave model, such as the WaveWatch 3, which is a NOAA model, so the way a model like WaveWatch 3 works is that you take wind maps from observation-based reanalysis. This is the GRS, or the Japanese-based reanalysis that's used for a lot of the CMIP experiments. From these wind speed reanalysis, you can compute the sea state by solving a spectral equation at every grid point and then taking care of propagation of the waves. So you can get sea state. And then from the sea state, you can get air entrainment through the breaking statistics. And so for that, you need to go from the wave spectrum, which is what WaveWatch solves, to the breaking statistics. This is something where Jiarong Hu, who is going to graduate this summer, has done a lot of work on. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to have to go quick on this. The idea has been to leverage a multi-layer approach to look at the breaking statistics. So not just a single breaking event, but the breaking statistics. And this is work that's still under review. So very quickly, it's leveraging, this is an animation of the simulation. And when you see the red patches, it's when the local velocity exceeds the phase speed of the wave. And so it's basically a breaking event. What it leverages is a recent piece of work from Stéphane Papinet, which discretized the Navier-Stokes equations vertically in a set of layers. So it's a multi-layer model. And what it allows is to get breaking modeled in a shock-like way at the surface. And so you get you can start from a wave statistics that then propagates, and whenever the wave becomes too steep, it breaks. So you can run simulations with various wave spectrum that are similar to what is observed in the field. So you see here these wave spectrum where we increase the amplitude, and then you let it go, and then you can extract the breaking distribution. And this is what is done on this slide, is as you see that as the mean square slope of the spectrum increase, so as the amount of energy at high frequency increases, you see that you get more and more breaking. So you start from the orange one and you go to the red one. And so this is like increasing the amount of energy at high frequency. And from this work, you can then find a scaling of your breaking distribution as a function of the mean square slope. And the mean square slope, you can get it from the wave spectrum. So what this is giving you is basically a way to go from the wave spectrum to the breaking distribution. And so if you go from the wave spectrum to the breaking distribution, then you can get these global map of air entrainment. And this work is like the work from Jarong basically reinforced work that was done separately by Leonel Romero in 2019 from a more theoretical point of view. So at the end of the day, you can use our formulation to compute sea salt emissions globally. This is a map of sea salt emissions average globally, and then you can look at their meridional profile. This is work that's been done by this is done that we have work that we have done with Brandon Reichel and Fabien Polo, who are a scientist at the NOAA GFDL lab. And we get that our formulation is very similar to an old one from Gong in 2003, but quite different from more recent one that have been proposed. And this is related to the temperature dependency. So I'm going to conclude with this. I hope I have convinced you that we can look at the air Cmax exchange related to bubbles through a multi-scale framework, analyzing, in a sense, each processes in detail and then combining them back together to propose new formulations for ocean-atmosphere exchange, and then bringing all of this fluid mechanics or a new physics into a global model using spectral wave modeling. And so the end goal to me is really to have this then implemented in global model where you have more physics, you have added variability, and see how it sorts of changes atmospheric and oceanic processes. And with that, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Luke. It was a very interesting talk. For those of you that are online, if you do have questions, you can raise your hand, unmute yourself, and I will call on you. So that left, it looks like you're first. So if you'd like to go ahead and unmute yourself, certainly turn on your camera if you'd like, and you can ask your question.
Well, thanks a lot. I in fact wanted to applaud, and I touched the wrong icon, but I also had a question. But I first wanted to explode, so I applaud like this. So it was a very nice talk, Luke, and I enjoyed it very much. I have a question on the effect of salt and surfactants. You mentioned that at some point, but I mean, in particular, the first part, when you looked into the bubble distribution in the ocean, I mean, we know from experience that it pretty much depends on the type of salt and also on the concentration of salt. And I wonder what part of your modeling would depend on this. And do you see any chances to put this into your multiphysics model or your hierarchical model, the effect of salt on first on the bubble distribution and then also indirectly on the droplet distribution?
Yeah, that's a great point. So a couple of remarks to this. So this plot that I have put back on the slide is a bubble size distribution from simulations where you have no salt, right? Simulations are, it's Navier-Stokes with none of these effects, two-phase Navier-Stokes. And then in there you have experiments, like the Dean and Stokes experiments are with salt water. Some of these experiments are with fresh water. So what you get, at least for the breakup of these large cavities, is that it seems that the size distribution down to 100 micron is not affected too much by the presence of salt. So that these two regimes are observed. When we go to the smaller scale lab experiment that we have done, again, we recover these two regimes. This is with salt water. We have done various levels of salt. You really start seeing differences for smaller bubbles. I know you have experiments where you were seeing much more dramatic changes with salt. And so I guess it might be depending on how, I don't know if you're starting from very large cavity that breaks down or if you're starting with smaller bubbles that break down.
We start with large bubbles and put them in, and it's very strongly turbulent. I mean, it's much more turbulent as in your case. So it may be connected with a degree of turbulence. So that's
possible. Yeah, that's possible. So yeah, so I would say for the moment, we haven't included variations in salt in the bubble size distribution. We have done work with surfactant, not in salt water, which was different than surfactant in salt water. And again, that R-3 was also popping up, but then you keep having more accumulation at smaller bubbles. So you have subtle effects that are not accounted for. And you will also have probably influence of surfactants on the film drop production process. Because it's gonna affect the way the film drains, it's gonna affect the way the droplets are created. And so that would also be, that might also play a role. All of this is sort of like things we keep working on. But yeah, the hope is that as you keep adding pieces, then you have the framework and you can add them to the framework. But yeah, these are all very good points.
Well, thanks a lot.
Alfredo, do you have a question?
Yes, actually, you've shown us twice. Well, the first question was similar to that. The one asked by Detlef, and you answered. Then the second one is related to the plot that you've shown us twice, which is the slide number 12 with the scaling. And you didn't comment the experiments by Blankizop and Blankizop and Chaplin. And why are they? So that is a problem related to what?
Yeah. So that's a very good question. When I started this work, I was sort of convinced that I would find something much more variation between the R-3 and the very flat thing from Blankizop and Chaplin. And that's why I keep showing them, because it's really a one data set that doesn't agree with this story. But I don't know why, right? And it's in everything that we did, like in the labs, numerically and all of that, we never got these sorts of results. So I don't know. Like I don't know why these ones are different from most of the other work.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry that I don't have a better answer to this question.
No, it was interesting because you kept showing that and you didn't comment on that.
Yeah,
and then
good point.
I might have another question. You were commenting about the filaments. Now the filaments are a temporary structure, so they just last. I don't know how long. But at some point, filaments should be counted as drops or as bubbles or not. So how do you fit the filament size, which is not spherical, into statistics of diameter scales?
Yeah, that's also a very good point. So I don't have the plot to show you the time evolution of the size distribution of these things. But so when I do this analysis, we are really looking at the time distribution, So I'm not really commenting on the volume defined size. What's in the paper, like if the 2021 paper from Agenor, which is referenced in the previous slide. This one, the JFM in 2021. We show the time evolution of the size distribution from these simulations. And you see an evolution, and when we do this, then we take the filament volume and we get an effective diameter.
Size.
An effective size, yeah. So as you point out, that's like not really the most accurate stuff, but the size distribution that looks like this, that shows this R-3½ is the N one, is the one when everything has sort of broken up. So there is always, in all of these analyses, there is always a question mark because these are all transient processes, as you know very well. And so we talk about sort of a quasi-steady state that's happening sort of at the end, but not really too late also, because otherwise like all the bubble disappear if you have buoyancy. So yeah, it's sort of like a sweet spot between the initial injection where you are very transient and before everything starts to go away in the case of breaking away. In the case of the bubble in the isotropic turbulence, it stays, right? At some point you reach a steady state or almost a steady state because not much is happening anymore. And that's the distribution we analyze. But we look at the time sequence to arrive at that moment. Do I answer your question, or?
Yes. So I just had this doubt regarding, because I mean, you have three options when you have filaments. Well, you can, in fact, four options. You can neglect them, eliminate those filaments, but you have to identify them. So you eliminate those from the statistics, or you can consider the smallest diameter, the longest size, or the equivalent size. And all these things have an impact on the distribution if you want to compute that. I mean, we have a problem right now, so we are just thinking of how to treat these things because they probably, if you're interested in breakup, you should consider the size of these filaments, which is the closer or the more physically relevant for the breakup. So it's still a problem with these temporary structures.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And so that's why, like in this analysis, the point was to say that we're gonna attribute a breakup time that is associated with the smallest scale. So that would be like the filament size. And that's where you see this capillary time scale popping up.
Okay, thank you very much, Luke.
Yeah.
So Luke, I have a question for you, and then I also have one in the chat that I'll give, and I think they're kind of related. At the very beginning, you showed a really nice cartoon that showed the different scales from the very large to the very small. And this is really for open ocean periodic waves. And I'm wondering, are the physics any different when the waves approach shore and interact with the shore, the subsurface of the ocean?
Yeah, so it's a very good point. We haven't looked at that in detail. We have done some on this, but not that much. I sort of expect the side. So the way the wave breaks is different, right? When the wave approaches shore, it breaks because the depths becomes shallower, so that the crests are moving faster than the trough, and then it breaks. Because we can explain the size distribution of bubbles based on arguments that have not much to do with the waves, I expect that it's going to be similar in the near shore. Actually, there are some data from Dean and Stokes that were taken in the near shore and that show at least the R-10³ to be very similar. They didn't get the smallest bubble, but so that I would expect to be similar. You can have much higher concentration of foam and bubbles in the near shore because it basically stays and accumulates. And in that case, the bursting physics is probably going to change quite a lot. You can have much higher density of organics, like because you have more biology near shore. You see that sometimes where you have bloom of a certain type of I'm forgetting the word, but of a certain type of algae, you get like very foamy stuff on the shore, and then you can imagine that everything I talked about in terms of bursting is modified, because it becomes like, yeah, another problem. So I would guess that the error entrainment and the size distribution of bubbles is going to be similar. The breaking threshold is different because that's completely controlled by the geometry. And I would bet that the way it bursts is different.
So kind of in a related, I think, question on the chat from Tomas Waklawzix. And he asks, are whitewater regions always, for arbitrary wave energy, domains where clearly separated air bubbles and water coexist, or is it only an assumption? And he says, in other words, is the separated flow model and the consequences thereof always sufficient to explain effects during breaking of the waves?
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's sort of like an hypothesis that we make that's at the center of this graph, right? We assume that each breaking event is going to be similar, and we assume that they're all sort of independent with each other. I think this is fine until you reach very high wind speed, like until you reach what's going to start to be classified as hurricane conditions, where then and the movie I showed is sort of at the edge of this. As long as every breaking wave occurs and the bubbles have the time to come back and do their thing before another one comes, then I think everything I'm talking about is perfectly reasonable. If you start getting in regimes where it's a complete washout and like the separation between the near air side and the water side becomes really blurry, and you have high densities of drops and foam everywhere, then probably some of the assumptions in terms of time scale separation and become questionable. So that would be my answer. I hope it's sort of where you want it to go. I think as long as you're below 20-25 meters per second, everything I am assuming is okay, but there are assumptions, right? That's the whole point of this framework, is instead of trying to do everything at once, we separate into more tractable problem. So always thinking whether or not the initial assumption is a good one is a good point.
So Tomas gives a nice smiley face, so you must be right on with the answer. Are there other questions from the audience? And again, you're welcome to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it. Or if you're uncomfortable doing that, you can certainly type in the chat. Well, look, it looks like that you've answered everyone's questions. This is a very enlightening talk. It was quite interesting.